What government information has been declassified but is not well known? Story 1. That governments that issue their own currency don't operate like households. For a long time, the public narrative around government spending has been simple. Governments have to collect money through taxes or borrowing before they can spend it. The comparison is usually made to a household budget. Income first, spending second. But documents, central bank reports, and economic explanations released over time by institutions like the Federal Reserve and other monetary authorities clarify that the mechanics actually work differently for countries that control their own fiat currency. In modern monetary systems, when a sovereign government spends new money is often created electronically through the banking system. Central banks and treasury systems coordinate to credit bank accounts, which increases the money supply. Taxes and government bonds don't literally fund spending the way people imagine. Instead, they play other roles, such as managing inflation, stabilizing interest rates, and creating demand for the currency. Story 2. The US. Military once had a unit whose entire job was basically to break into its own bases and show how bad the security actually was. And they did it in ways that sound straight out of a movie. It was called Red Cell, created by the United States Navy and run by Richard Marcinko. After the Iran hostage crisis made the military realize a lot of bases had never really tested their defenses against real terrorist tactics. So Red Cell acted like the enemy. They would try to sneak onto bases using fake IDs, bluff their way past guards, climb fences, or exploit sloppy procedures. And in some exercises, they even simulated kidnapping high-ranking officers or taking hostages just to prove how easily someone could get inside supposedly secure facilities. The point wasn't to actually hurt anyone, it was to embarrass the system enough that the military would fix its security gaps. Apparently it worked a little too well because a lot of commanders hated being exposed like that, and the program was eventually shut down. But the idea stuck around. Today the same concept exists everywhere as red teams, groups whose job is literally to attack your own defenses, so you find the weaknesses before someone really does. Story 3. That the famous Roswell UFO incident was actually connected to a secret Cold War surveillance project. The program was called Project Mogul, run by the United States Army Air Forces in the late 1940s. The idea was to launch long chains of high-altitude balloons carrying sensitive microphones and sensors that could detect shockwaves from nuclear tests. If the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb, the sound waves traveling through the upper atmosphere could theoretically be picked up by these balloons. In 1947, one of those balloon arrays crashed near Roswell. The debris looked strange, foil-like material, sticks, and odd components, because it was part of classified equipment. Since the project was secret, the military gave confusing explanations at the time. First they said it was a flying disc, then quickly changed the story to a weather balloon. That sudden reversal helped fuel decades of UFO speculation. Years later, once Project Mogul was declassified, it became clear the crashed debris most likely came from one of those nuclear detection balloon arrays. So one of the most famous UFO stories in history was probably just Cold War spy technology falling out of the sky. Story 4. During the 1968 election, members of Richard Nixon's campaign secretly encouraged the government of South Vietnam to stay away from the Paris peace talks. At the time, President Lyndon B. Johnson was trying to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War before the election. The peace talks in Paris were a major part of that effort. But intercepted communications and later released documents showed that Nixon's campaign was privately signaling to South Vietnam that they might get a better deal if they delayed negotiations until after the election. The message was essentially, hold off, wait for Nixon. South Vietnam ultimately pulled back from participating fully in the talks, which damaged the negotiations. Johnson even privately referred to the move as treason, but he chose not to publicly expose it at the time because revealing the evidence would have required disclosing sensitive intelligence sources. The information only became widely known years later after recordings, documents, and investigations surfaced. Whether the move directly prolonged the war is still debated by historians, but the episode, sometimes called the Chinook Affair, showed how geopolitical negotiations were entangled with domestic politics during the election. It's one of those Cold War-era political maneuvers that stayed largely hidden for decades before the details slowly came out. Story 5. That the US government once funded experiments trying to see if people could psychically spy on distant places. The program was called Stargate Project, run by the Central Intelligence Agency and later the Defense Intelligence Agency during the Cold War. Researchers were testing something called remote viewing, where participants claimed they could mentally perceive locations, objects, or events far away without physically being there. In one of the stranger sessions from the 1980s, a remote viewer was asked to describe coordinates on Mars, but set about 1 million years in the past. The viewer described massive structures, tall, thin beings, and what he interpreted as the ruins of a dying civilization. The transcript of that session was later declassified and released. The important part, though, the government never confirmed any of it as real. The program ran for years because intelligence agencies were curious whether psychic perception could work as a surveillance tool against the Soviet Union. Eventually, the program was shut down in the 90s, after reviews concluded the results weren't reliable for intelligence use. So yes, there are official documents where someone claims they psychically visited ancient Mars, not because the government believed Mars had a lost civilization, but because during the Cold War they were willing to test almost anything that might give them an edge. Story 6. The so-called Montauk experiments. The story claims that during the Cold War, the US government ran secret mind control and psychic experiments at a base near Montauk Air Force Station on the eastern tip of Long Island. According to the claims, the military was experimenting with things like psychological warfare, remote viewing, and even time manipulation. The narrative mostly comes from a man named Preston Nichols, who in the 1990s said he had recovered suppressed memories of working on the project. He described experiments involving psychic amplifiers, mind control, and bizarre attempts to open portals or influence reality using electromagnetic equipment. Here's the important part, though. Unlike some other Cold War programs, there's no solid evidence that these specific experiments actually happened. What is real is that Montauk Air Force Station existed and was part of the US military's radar network during the Cold War, connected to systems like SAGE radar network that were designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers. The more extreme claims about time travel, monsters, and psychic warfare mostly come from books and interviews rather than confirmed government documents. So Montauk sits in a weird space, a real military base, real Cold War secrecy, and a lot of stories layered on top of it over the years. Story 7. That there actually was far more Soviet espionage inside the US government during the Cold War than most people realized at the time. During the early 1950s, Joseph McCarthy became famous for claiming communist agents had infiltrated American institutions. His accusations were often reckless and poorly supported, which eventually discredited him. But decades later, after the Cold War ended, previously classified intelligence projects like Venona Project were declassified. Venona had secretly decrypted thousands of Soviet intelligence messages sent between Moscow and agents operating in the United States. Those decryptions confirmed that Soviet intelligence had successfully recruited or influenced a number of Americans working in sensitive positions, including scientists involved in the Manhattan Project and individuals connected to government agencies. For example, figures like Klaus Fuchs and Julius Rosenberg were part of real espionage networks. So while McCarthy's methods and accusations were widely criticized, later declassified documents showed that Soviet espionage inside the US during the 1940s and early Cold War was real and more extensive than the public understood at the time. The history turned out to be more complicated than the simple narrative most people learned. Story 8. That the sinking of the RMS Lusitania was more complicated than the simple story most people learned. In 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat during World War I, killing nearly 1,200 people, including many civilians. At the time, the tragedy was widely portrayed as a purely civilian passenger ship being attacked without justification. But later investigations and government records revealed the ship was also carrying war materials. The British government eventually acknowledged that the ship had munitions on board when it sank. The official cargo manifest listed things like rifle cartridges, shell casings, and other military supplies that were technically allowed under international law for merchant ships. However, decades later there were debates and salvage concerns because some researchers believed the cargo may have included additional explosive materials not fully disclosed at the time. In the 1980s, when salvage operations were proposed at the wreck site off the coast of Ireland, the British government confirmed that ammunition was present in the wreck and restricted certain salvage efforts, partly because disturbing the cargo could be dangerous. Historians still debate the details of exactly what was aboard and how much it mattered militarily, but the incident shows that the line between civilian and military targets during wartime was sometimes blurred. The sinking remains one of the most controversial naval incidents of the war, partly because the full story about the cargo only became clearer long after the event itself. Story 9. That the scandal that destroyed a presidential campaign in 1987 may have been politically engineered. The incident involved Gary Hart, who was widely considered the front-runner for the 1988 Democratic nomination. His campaign collapsed after reporters exposed a relationship with a woman aboard a yacht called Monkey Business, which turned into a huge media scandal almost overnight. Years later, claims surfaced that political operative Lee Atwater, known for aggressive campaign tactics during the era of Ronald Reagan, privately admitted involvement in setting up the situation that led to the story breaking. According to people who said they spoke with him near the end of his life, Atwater allegedly confessed that he had helped engineer the circumstances around the scandal to damage Hart's campaign. However, the claim has never been fully confirmed and remains debated among journalists and historians. What is undisputed is that the scandal effectively ended Hart's presidential run and became a turning point in American political journalism, marking the moment when reporters began aggressively investigating the personal lives of candidates. So while the details of the alleged confession remain murky, the episode is often cited as an example of how opposition research and political dirty tricks became a major force in modern campaigns. Story 10. Near the end of World War II, British planners seriously studied the possibility of a war between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The plan was called Operation Unthinkable, and it was ordered by Winston Churchill in 1945. The idea was to evaluate whether the Western Allies could push Soviet forces out of Eastern Europe after Germany was defeated and limit the spread of Soviet influence. British military planners analyzed a scenario where forces from the United Kingdom and United States, possibly alongside rearmed German units, would launch an offensive against the Soviet Union. The analysis concluded the plan would be extremely difficult because the Soviets had enormous numbers of troops already positioned across Eastern Europe. The planners essentially determined the operation would likely lead to a massive, prolonged war with uncertain chances of success. Because of that assessment and the fact that the war with Germany had just ended, the proposal never moved forward and remained classified for decades. When the documents were eventually released years later, they revealed just how quickly wartime alliances were giving way to Cold War tensions. The name Unthinkable was not an exaggeration. It was literally the planners acknowledging how extreme the scenario would have been. Story 11. That the US military seriously studied the idea of dropping giant metal rods from space as weapons. The concept is usually called rods from God, sometimes referred to as kinetic orbital bombardment. The idea showed up in US military research in the early 2000s and was discussed in studies tied to the United States Air Force. The proposal was surprisingly simple. Put satellites in orbit carrying long tungsten rods, basically telephone pole-sized pieces of extremely dense metal. When needed, one would be released and fall toward Earth at hypersonic speeds. No explosives required. Because of the speed and mass, the rod would hit the ground with enormous kinetic energy, creating a destructive impact similar to a small bunker buster bomb. The main advantage would be speed and penetration. The strike could hit hardened underground targets almost anywhere on Earth within minutes. The concept was studied as part of broader discussions around space-based weapons and prompt global strike capabilities, but it was never actually deployed. The reasons were mostly practical. Launching and maintaining the system would be extremely expensive, and it raised major legal and political concerns about weaponizing space. Still, the idea exists in real military planning documents, which means at some point people seriously considered the idea of orbital tungsten spears falling from space as weapons. Story 12. That the British once planned to bury nuclear landmines in Germany and keep them warm with chickens. The project was called Blue Peacock, developed in the 1950s by the British Army during the early Cold War. The idea was to hide nuclear devices in West Germany that could be detonated if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe. If Soviet forces advanced, the mines could be triggered to destroy infrastructure, contaminate territory, and slow the invasion. But engineers ran into a weird problem. The electronics inside the bombs could fail if temperatures dropped too low during winter. One proposed solution, seriously written into planning documents, was to place live chickens inside the device casing with food and water. The chicken's body heat would keep the internal components warm enough for the bomb to function for about a week. Yes, the official solution was basically nuclear bomb plus poultry. The project was eventually canceled in 1958 because it was considered too dangerous and politically risky. Decades later, when the files were declassified, the chicken heating idea became one of the strangest footnotes of Cold War planning. It's a reminder that some of the most surreal ideas in history were written down in very serious military documents. Story 13. The US military studied a weapon concept nicknamed Thor's hammer. The idea was part of research connected to the United States Air Force and later discussions around prompt global strike. The concept was similar to the so-called rods from God idea. A satellite in orbit would carry large tungsten rods and release them toward targets on Earth. Because the rods would fall from space at extremely high speeds, the impact alone would release massive kinetic energy. No explosives needed. The force of the strike could potentially destroy hardened underground bunkers or missile silos simply through momentum. In theory, it would allow near-instant strikes anywhere on the planet. But it never became a real deployed weapon. Launching and maintaining such a system would be extremely expensive, and it raised serious concerns about weaponizing space and escalating arms races between major powers. So while the name sounds like something out of mythology, Thor's hammer was actually a real military concept that appeared in defense research discussions, essentially the idea of dropping hypersonic metal projectiles from orbit as weapons. Story 14. That Russian intelligence had undercover agents living normal lives in the US for years. The investigation was called Operation Ghost Stories, run by the Federal Bureau of Investigation during the 2000s. The targets were illegals, deep cover operatives sent by SVR to live in the United States under completely fabricated identities. These agents weren't diplomats or obvious spies. They built ordinary lives. Some posed as suburban parents, small business owners, or professionals. They raised children, owned homes, and blended into American communities while quietly gathering information and maintaining contact with Russian intelligence. After years of surveillance, the FBI arrested 10 of these agents in 2010. One of the most widely reported was Anna Chapman. The case didn't involve dramatic stolen nuclear secrets or movie-style espionage. Instead, the agents were mostly tasked with building networks, gathering open-source information, and positioning themselves for long-term intelligence work. Soon after the arrests, the spies were exchanged in a Cold War-style swap between the United States and Russia. The case revealed that even decades after the Cold War ended, traditional human espionage networks were still very much active. Story 15. During the Cold War, U.S. intelligence agencies had programs aimed at influencing media narratives. One of the most frequently cited examples is Operation Mockingbird, associated with the Central Intelligence Agency in the early Cold War period. Investigations in the 1970s, particularly those by the Church Committee, revealed that the CIA had relationships with certain journalists and media outlets as part of its broader psychological and information operations against Soviet influence. These relationships sometimes involved providing information, shaping narratives, or supporting anti-communist messaging in the press. During that era, intelligence agencies in many countries viewed media influence as a strategic tool in the global ideological competition of the Cold War. However, the claim that Operation Mockingbird never ceased is widely debated and not supported by confirmed documentation. The investigations in the 1970s led to new oversight rules and restrictions intended to limit intelligence agencies from covertly influencing domestic media. What the declassified records clearly show is that governments did experiment with media influence operations during the Cold War. The long-term extent of those efforts, and whether similar strategies persist today, remains a subject of ongoing debate among historians and journalists. Story 16. That the U.S. government has officially studied unidentified aerial phenomena for years. The Pentagon ran a program called Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program starting in the mid-2000s. It was overseen by the United States Department of Defense and investigated reports of strange objects encountered by military pilots. As part of this, the Navy later released several cockpit videos showing unidentified objects performing unusual maneuvers. Videos often referred to as FLIR, gimbal, and go fast. These were captured by pilots from the United States Navy and eventually declassified and confirmed as authentic footage of unexplained aerial encounters. Important detail though, unidentified doesn't mean confirmed alien technology. Government reports so far say many sightings remain unexplained because of limited data, sensor issues, or unknown technologies, but none of the official investigations have concluded that extraterrestrial craft are responsible. As for the idea that governments have reverse-engineered alien technology, there's no confirmed evidence in declassified material supporting that claim. What is real is that governments now openly track and investigate these sightings because unknown objects in restricted airspace could represent surveillance technology or potential threats. So the truth is a bit less sci-fi than people imagine. The government did study UFO sightings, but the declassified documents mostly show investigators trying to figure out what they were, not secretly building alien spacecraft. Story 17. That the US once tried to build a nuclear-powered cruise missile that could fly around the planet spreading radiation. The program was called Project Pluto, run in the late 1950s and 60s by the United States Air Force during the height of the Cold War. The missile concept, called SLAM, Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile, would use a nuclear reactor instead of normal fuel. Air would pass directly through the reactor to heat it, turning the missile into a nuclear ramjet. That meant it could theoretically fly for extremely long distances at supersonic speeds while skimming just above the ground. Along the way, it could drop multiple nuclear warheads, and even its exhaust would be radioactive. Simply flying low over enemy territory could cause massive destruction through shockwaves and radiation. The engine itself was actually built and tested in Nevada under the name Tori. Because the reactor produced intense radiation, engineers observing the test stood far away near a fallout shelter stocked with weeks of supplies in case something went wrong. Despite successfully testing the engine, the project was eventually canceled in 1964. By that time, intercontinental ballistic missiles had become more practical and the idea of a missile spewing radioactive exhaust across the planet was considered dangerously escalatory. Even by Cold War standards, Project Pluto was one of the most extreme weapons concepts ever seriously pursued. Story 18. Scientists once seriously studied nuclear-powered spacecraft that moved by detonating atomic bombs behind them. The concept was called Project Orion, studied in the late 1950s and early 1960s with support from the United States Air Force and NASA. The idea was wild but technically simple. A spacecraft would eject small nuclear bombs out the back, detonate them, and ride the shockwaves forward using a massive reinforced pusher plate. Each explosion would push the ship forward like a gigantic series of nuclear pulses. In theory, this could have produced spacecraft far more powerful than chemical rockets. Design studies suggested Orion ships could weigh thousands of tons, carry massive crews, and reach the outer planets much faster than conventional rockets. Some concepts even imagined huge interplanetary vessels, basically space battleships powered by nuclear detonations. The physics actually worked on paper. What killed the project wasn't engineering. It was politics and treaties. Atmospheric nuclear launches would have scattered radioactive fallout, and the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty effectively ended the possibility of testing the system. So one of the most powerful spacecraft concepts ever designed never flew, not because it was impossible, but because it required launching into space by setting off nuclear explosions. Story 19. Maybe not terrifying as much as disturbing. NATO coordinated a series of secret military organizations in Europe after World War II, under the theory that if Europe was overrun by the Soviet Union, there would need to be a ready-made partisan network in place to resist it. This extended to units of each country's military, but also involved long-serving politicians and civilians that carried this affiliation around with them their whole lives. This went on until the 1990s when the Soviet government fell and the Italian government determined that the military assets in this program had moved beyond democratic control. Specifically, they appeared to be getting involved with right-wing terrorist groups, although it was not clear if they were under orders for this or if it was extracurricular. Their units were publicly exposed under the name Operation Gladio, and investigations and disclosures by other nations eventually outed other organizations in other nations. Periodically, people still stumble across an arms cache or other equipment from this plan. I can see why such a plan would exist, but the lack of oversight easily qualifies as a threat to sovereignty. It is also some next-level tinfoil hat stuff. Story 20. That during the Cold War, governments really did run experiments exposing their own populations to chemicals without their knowledge. One of the best documented examples is MK-Ultra, run by the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1950s. The program explored ways to manipulate human behavior, using drugs like LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other techniques. In several cases, people were given substances without informed consent to study the effects. There were also military tests involving chemical and biological agents. For example, the United States Army conducted aerosol dispersion experiments in some cities to study how biological weapons might spread through urban environments. In certain tests, harmless or low-risk simulant particles were released to track how they move through populations and infrastructure. Most of this only became widely known after investigations in the 1970s, particularly by the Church Committee, which exposed several intelligence and military programs that had operated with little oversight. Many of these activities were later condemned and led to stronger rules around human experimentation, informed consent, and oversight of intelligence agencies. The revelations were controversial because they showed that during the Cold War, governments were sometimes willing to test extreme ideas in the name of national security, even when civilians were unknowingly involved. Story 21. That military pilots have reported seeing unidentified objects in the sky for decades, and the government eventually admitted some of the footage is real. The United States Navy confirmed and released several cockpit videos showing unidentified aerial objects recorded during training missions. These videos, often called FLIR, gimbal, and go fast, show objects moving in ways that pilots said they couldn't easily explain. The footage became public after investigations tied to programs like the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which was run by the United States Department of Defense to look into unusual aerial encounters. The key point is that the government acknowledged the objects were unidentified, not that they were alien spacecraft. In many cases, there simply wasn't enough sensor data to determine what they were. They could be unusual atmospheric effects, experimental technology, sensor artifacts, or something else entirely. Still, it was a big shift when the military openly confirmed that some of the widely circulated UFO videos were authentic recordings from real pilots and real aircraft systems. Not proof of aliens, but definitely proof that even highly trained pilots sometimes see things in the sky they can't immediately explain. Story 22. That the US government once seriously studied using bats as biological weapons during World War II. The program was called Project X-ray, run by the United States Army Air Forces in the early 1940s. The idea was surprisingly straightforward. Attach tiny incendiary charges to bats, release thousands of them over enemy cities, and let them naturally roost in buildings before the timers triggered the fires. Because many buildings in Japan at the time were made largely of wood and paper, planners believed the bats would spread hundreds of small fires across a wide area, causing massive damage. They actually tested the idea. In one famous test accident, some bats escaped early with live incendiaries attached and ended up burning down part of the test facility. That incident ironically proved the concept might work. Despite early success, the project was eventually canceled in 1944 because the Manhattan Project was progressing and promised a faster path to ending the war. So for a brief moment in history, the US military was seriously developing bat-delivered firebombs as a weapon. Story 23. That the US military once reviewed research into reincarnation claims involving children. In the 1980s, a document often referred to online as the Pentagon Reincarnation Report circulated within parts of US military intelligence. The report summarized work by psychiatrist Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, who had spent decades investigating children who claimed to remember details from previous lives. Stevenson documented thousands of cases worldwide where young children reported memories of people who had died, sometimes including names, places, and events that investigators attempted to verify. In a few instances, the reports claimed the children described specific details about deceased individuals they had never met. The military interest wasn't about proving reincarnation. Cold War intelligence agencies were broadly curious about human consciousness, memory, and unusual cognitive phenomena, especially during the same era that programs like remote viewing were being studied. The report simply summarized existing academic research and evaluated whether it had any potential relevance to intelligence work. No official conclusion ever confirmed reincarnation as real, but the fact that intelligence analysts were willing to review and catalog research on it shows how wide the net of Cold War experimentation and curiosity sometimes went. Story 24. That the US Air Force ran a long official investigation into UFO sightings for nearly 2 decades. The program was called Project Blue Book, run by the United States Air Force from 1952 to 1969 during the Cold War. Its job was to collect and analyze reports of unidentified flying objects, especially sightings reported by military pilots, radar operators, and civilians. Investigators wanted to know whether these objects represented advanced foreign technology, natural phenomena, or something else. Over the course of the program, more than 12,000 UFO sightings were investigated. Most were eventually explained as things like weather balloons, aircraft, astronomical objects, or optical illusions. But several hundred cases remained officially unidentified because there wasn't enough information to determine what they were. In 1969, the Air Force closed the program after concluding that the sightings didn't appear to represent a national security threat, and that there was no evidence of extraterrestrial technology. Even so, the declassified files showed that for years, the government quietly collected and analyzed reports of strange aerial phenomena, something many people assumed was purely science fiction. Story 25. The Huddle Memo. It's a short memo written in 1950 by Guy Huddle and sent to J. Edgar Hoover. The memo summarized a report from an unnamed informant who claimed that 3 flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. According to the memo, each craft supposedly contained small humanoid bodies about 3 feet tall, wearing metallic suits. The document is real and was later released by the Federal Bureau of Investigation when historical records were declassified. Because of the strange description, it became one of the most widely circulated UFO-related government documents. But the important context is that the memo wasn't a confirmed investigation or official conclusion. It was simply the FBI passing along an unverified claim that had come from a third-party source. There was no evidence attached and no follow-up confirming the story. In other words, it shows that unusual reports were sometimes logged and circulated inside government agencies, even when they were just rumors or unverified tips. The document is real. The story inside it was never proven. Story 26. The Robertson Panel Report. In 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency convened a group of scientists led by physicist Howard P. Robertson to review the growing number of UFO sightings being reported in the United States. This happened during the early Cold War, when officials were worried that unidentified objects in the sky might be Soviet technology, or that mass UFO sightings could overwhelm military radar systems and communication. After reviewing military reports, photographs, and footage collected by programs like Project Blue Book, the panel concluded that most sightings likely had ordinary explanations, such as aircraft, weather balloons, astronomical objects, or optical effects. But the more interesting recommendation wasn't about aliens. The panel suggested that UFO reports should be publicly debunked and downplayed through media, education, and public messaging. The concern was that widespread belief in UFOs could create public panic or be exploited by foreign adversaries for psychological warfare. So the report wasn't just about investigating UFOs, it was also about managing how the public perceived them. It became one of the early examples of governments thinking about UFOs not just as unexplained objects, but as a potential information and psychological issue during the Cold War. Story 27. The Family Jewels. In 1973, the Central Intelligence Agency compiled an internal document listing some of its most questionable and potentially illegal activities carried out over the previous decades. The report was requested by CIA Director James R. Schlesinger, who asked staff to disclose any operations that might violate the agency's charter. The resulting file, nicknamed the Family Jewels, described a range of Cold War-era activities, including surveillance of American citizens, plots to assassinate foreign leaders, mail interception programs, and drug experiments connected to programs like MKUltra. The documents stayed classified for decades, but were eventually released in 2007 after pressure from historians and journalists. What made the file so striking was that it wasn't written by critics of the CIA. It was an internal accounting of controversial operations the agency itself believed could cause serious political fallout if exposed. The release of the Family Jewels helped confirm many allegations that had circulated for years about intelligence abuses during the Cold War. It also contributed to the push for stronger congressional oversight of intelligence agencies in the decades that followed. Story 28. The Majestic 12 Papers. In the 1980s, a set of documents began circulating that claimed the U.S. government had created a secret committee called Majestic 12 shortly after World War II to manage recovered UFO technology and extraterrestrial materials. According to the papers, the group supposedly reported directly to the highest levels of the U.S. government and oversaw investigations into incidents like the alleged crash near Roswell. The documents listed well-known figures of the time, including scientists and military leaders, and described a classified program studying recovered craft and non-human technology. However, the authenticity of the papers has been heavily disputed. Investigations by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Air Force concluded that the documents were most likely fabricated. Analysts pointed to inconsistencies in formatting, terminology, and historical details that didn't match genuine government records. So while the Majestic 12 papers became one of the most famous alleged leaks in UFO history, they're generally considered a hoax by historians and government investigators. Still, the episode shows how powerful the mystery around Cold War secrecy and UFO reports became, and how easily claims about hidden government programs can take on a life of their own. Story 29. Before the more famous Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force ran an earlier program called Project Grudge. It started in 1949 during the early Cold War, when reports of flying saucers were spreading across the United States. The military wanted to know whether these sightings were experimental aircraft, foreign technology from the Soviet Union, or simply misidentified natural phenomena. Project Grudge collected and analyzed hundreds of UFO reports from pilots, radar operators, and civilians. But unlike later programs, Grudge had a reputation for being extremely skeptical. Investigators generally tried to explain sightings as balloons, aircraft, weather effects, or hoaxes. And the official conclusion was that there was no evidence UFOs represented advanced technology or extraterrestrial craft. Critics later argued that the program was more focused on debunking sightings and calming public concern than on deeply investigating. In 1952, Project Grudge was replaced by Project Blue Book, which became the longest-running official U.S. government UFO investigation. So for a few years in the early Cold War, the U.S. Air Force quietly ran a program whose main job was figuring out what people were seeing in the sky and reassuring the public that it probably wasn't anything extraordinary. Story 30. Project Sunshine. In the early 1950s, during the height of nuclear weapons testing, scientists working with the United States Atomic Energy Commission launched a secret research effort to measure how radioactive fallout was spreading through the human population. The key element they were studying was strontium-90, a radioactive byproduct of nuclear explosions that can accumulate in human bones and teeth. To measure it, researchers collected and analyzed thousands of human bone samples from around the world. Many of those samples came from deceased infants and children because their bones absorbed strontium-90 more quickly while growing. The controversial part is that in many cases, families were never told their relatives' remains were being used in the study. The program quietly gathered samples from hospitals, medical examiners, and burial sites in order to measure how nuclear testing was affecting the environment and human bodies. When details about the project became public years later, it caused major ethical backlash and raised serious questions about consent and research practices during the Cold War. The research itself helped scientists understand the global spread of radioactive fallout and eventually contributed to political pressure for nuclear testing restrictions, including the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. But the methods used in Project Sunshine remain one of the more disturbing examples of how far Cold War research sometimes went behind the scenes. Story 31. Operation Mongoose. In the early 1960s, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a large covert campaign aimed at destabilizing the government of Fidel Castro in Cuba. The operation involved sabotage, propaganda, economic disruption, and support for anti-Castro groups. Plans included damaging infrastructure, spreading anti-government messaging, and encouraging internal resistance against Castro's regime. Some of the most infamous proposals involved elaborate assassination ideas targeting Castro, though many of those never progressed beyond planning stages. Operation Mongoose became one of the largest covert operations of the Cold War and was run under the supervision of the U.S. government during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. The program was eventually shut down after the Cuban Missile Crisis dramatically raised tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Much of what happened in Operation Mongoose only became widely known years later through declassified documents and congressional investigations into Cold War intelligence activities. Story 32. During the Cold War, the CIA actually experimented with psychics trying to gather intelligence, including interrogating or describing unknown targets without being physically present. The work was part of programs that eventually became known as the Stargate Project, run by U.S. intelligence agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1970s and 80s. The idea was called remote viewing. Certain participants claimed they could mentally perceive distant locations, objects, or events. During some sessions, remote viewers were given coordinates or vague prompts and asked to describe what they saw. Declassified transcripts show them sketching structures, vehicles, landscapes, and sometimes even describing supposed extraterrestrial locations or unidentified craft. One unusual session involved a viewer being asked to describe a location connected to UFO reports. Another famous experiment asked a viewer to mentally observe a site on Mars in the distant past. The descriptions included strange structures and beings, though none of the claims were ever verified. The intelligence agencies weren't trying to prove aliens were real. They were exploring whether psychic perception could be used as a surveillance tool during the Cold War, especially if the Soviet Union was researching similar ideas. After years of testing, the program was shut down in the 1990s because the results weren't considered reliable for intelligence purposes. But the declassified documents still show something pretty strange. For a period of time, intelligence agencies seriously experimented with psychic spying sessions as part of national security research. Story 33. The FBI vault contains a collection of documents related to the famous Roswell incident. The files were originally created in the late 1940s when reports of flying saucers were spreading across the United States. The Federal Bureau of Investigation collected various memos, witness reports, and communications from military and intelligence sources discussing unidentified objects and alleged crash recoveries. Many of these documents were later released publicly through the FBI's digital archive starting in the 2000s, though some had been partially declassified earlier in the 1970s and 80s. One of the most widely circulated documents in the archive is the Huddle memo, which summarized a claim that 3 saucers and small humanoid bodies had been recovered in New Mexico. The memo didn't present confirmed evidence. It simply passed along an unverified report from a source. The files show that government agencies were collecting and sharing information about UFO sightings and rumors during the early Cold War, partly because they wanted to determine whether the objects represented foreign technology or something misidentified in the sky. Most of the documents don't confirm extraterrestrial activity, but they do show how seriously authorities tracked and cataloged the growing number of UFO reports during that era. Story 34. The story is often called the Philadelphia Experiment. According to the claim, a secret naval experiment in 1943 supposedly made a warship invisible or even caused it to teleport. The ship most often linked to the story is the USS Eldridge, and the alleged experiment is said to have taken place in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The story didn't actually appear during the war. It started circulating in the 1950s through letters from a man named Carl Meredith Allen, who claimed the U.S. Navy had run a classified project using powerful electromagnetic fields to bend light around a ship. Over time, the story grew into more extreme claims: invisibility, teleportation, and even crew members being fused into the ship. However, the United States Navy has repeatedly stated that no such experiment occurred, and historians have found no evidence in declassified records supporting the claims. Investigations suggest the story likely grew out of misunderstandings about real wartime technologies like degaussing. a method used to reduce a ship's magnetic signature to avoid naval mines. So while the Philadelphia experiment is one of the most famous Cold War-era conspiracy stories, it's generally considered a legend that developed decades after World War II rather than a confirmed declassified government project. Story 35. The so-called Magic Eyes Only UFO briefings. These documents supposedly described highly classified briefings given to senior U.S. officials about recovered UFO technology and extraterrestrial encounters sometime between the 1950s and early 1960s. The papers are often tied to the alleged secret oversight group Majestic 12, which some claim was created after the Roswell incident to manage information about recovered craft. The phrase "magic eyes only" supposedly meant the material was restricted to the highest levels of government and intelligence officials. However, like the Majestic 12 documents themselves, these briefings are widely disputed. Investigations by agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Air Force have concluded that the documents are likely fabricated. Analysts found inconsistencies in formatting, language, and historical details that didn't match genuine classified documents from the era. So while the Magic Eyes Only papers became famous in UFO circles, historians generally consider them part of the same controversial set of alleged Majestic 12 leaks rather than verified declassified government records. They remain one of the most debated pieces of Cold War-era UFO lore. Story 36. The Friedman UFO Briefing, 1958. This refers to a document sometimes discussed in UFO research circles that allegedly summarized a briefing about unidentified flying objects given to government or military officials in the late 1950s. The briefing is often connected to discussions around U.S. Air Force investigations like Project Blue Book, which at the time was collecting reports of unusual aerial sightings during the Cold War. The name Friedman is often linked to later UFO researcher Stanton T. Friedman, who spent decades investigating government records about UFO cases and the Roswell incident. However, unlike officially archived reports such as the Robertson panel report, the so-called Friedman briefing is not widely recognized as a confirmed government document in official archives. References to it mostly come from secondary sources, UFO researchers, and discussions around Cold War-era intelligence briefings. What is well documented is that during the 1950s, the U.S. military and intelligence community regularly briefed officials on UFO reports because they wanted to determine whether sightings represented misidentified aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, or potentially advanced technology from adversaries like the Soviet Union. So the broader context, government briefings about UFO sightings absolutely happened. But the specific Friedman UFO briefing remains more obscure and debated than many of the better documented Cold War UFO investigations. Story 37. During the Cold War, the US government secretly detonated high-altitude nuclear weapons in space to see what would happen. One of the most famous tests was Starfish Prime, part of Operation Fishbowl, conducted by the United States Department of Defense. In 1962, the US launched a nuclear warhead on a rocket and detonated it about 400 kilometers above Earth over the Pacific Ocean. The results were far stranger than expected. The explosion created an artificial radiation belt around the planet that damaged or destroyed several satellites in orbit. The electromagnetic pulse from the blast also knocked out streetlights and electrical systems hundreds of miles away in Hawaii. The sky itself lit up with massive artificial auroras visible across much of the Pacific. Scientists were trying to understand how nuclear weapons might behave in space and whether they could be used to disrupt enemy communications or satellites. Instead, the test showed that detonating nukes in space could damage your own technology in orbit. The unexpected consequences from tests like Starfish Prime were one of the reasons countries later agreed to limit nuclear testing, eventually leading to treaties banning nuclear explosions in space. Story 38. During the Cold War, the U.S. military secretly tested how biological weapons might spread through a major American city. The experiment was called Operation Sea Spray, conducted by the United States Navy in 1950. The Navy released a cloud of bacteria off the coast of San Francisco to study how biological agents might move through urban environments. The bacteria used were considered relatively harmless at the time and were meant to simulate how a biological weapon could disperse through the air. Sensors around the city later showed that the particles had spread widely through the urban area, meaning a real biological agent could potentially infect large portions of the population. The public wasn't informed at the time. Decades later, when the experiment became public through declassified documents and investigations into Cold War military testing, it sparked major controversy about ethics and informed consent. It was one of several Cold War experiments that showed how far governments were willing to go in studying chemical and biological warfare during that period. Story 39, that the U.S. government once secretly ran a program to control the weather during the Vietnam War. The operation was called Operation Popeye carried out by the United States Air Force between 1967 and 1972. The idea was to extend the monsoon season over key supply routes used by North Vietnamese forces, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Aircraft would fly over the region and release silver iodide into storm clouds to encourage more rainfall. The goal was to soften roads, cause landslides, and make it harder to move trucks and equipment through the jungle. In short, they were trying to weaponize the weather. The program remained classified until the 1970s, when it was revealed during investigations in the United States Congress. The disclosure caused international backlash and helped lead to the Environmental Modification Convention, which banned the use of environmental manipulation like weather control as a weapon of war. So for several years during the Vietnam War, the US military was literally trying to make it rain on the enemy as a strategic tactic. Story 40. That the US government once detonated nuclear bombs underground just to see if they could dig massive canals with them. The project was called Project Plowshare, run by the United States Atomic Energy Commission starting in the late 1950s. The idea was to use nuclear explosions for large engineering projects. Scientists believed nukes might be useful for quickly excavating things like harbors, canals, or mining operations. One of the most famous tests was Sedan Crater, which took place at the Nevada test site. The blast created a massive crater about 390 meters wide and 100 meters deep, still one of the largest man-made craters in the United States. In theory, similar explosions could have been used to carve new waterways or expand ports. In practice, the tests created huge amounts of radioactive contamination, making the idea impractical. By the 1970s, the program was shut down because the environmental and political costs were too high. But for a period during the Cold War, scientists were seriously exploring the idea of using nuclear weapons as giant construction tools.